Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Creating Clarity, Addressing Misconceptions about the MBTI Assessment webinar. My name is Larry Romero, Channel Marketing Manager here at CPP. I'll be moderating today's webinar. This webinar is a result of you sharing your direct experiences out in the field, a representation of your stories from the front lines. With that, on behalf of CPP, we are truly grateful for the positive impact you're making out there. Thank you. Today's webinar will run for approximately 1 hour. At the end of the presentation, Patrick will be answering your questions, so start thinking about what you may want to ask, and please submit them to me at any time using the question function in the webinar controls. Please note this webinar is being recorded, and within the next few days, we'll email you a link to the recording along with the link to the recently published Creating Clarity white paper that Patrick Kerwin authored. Now, I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker, Patrick Kerwin. Patrick is a principal of Kerwin and Associates in San Diego, California, specializing in the development of teams, leaders, and organizations. An MBTI master practitioner, Patrick has over 25 years experience using the MBTI assessment with corporate, healthcare, education, and nonprofit organizations. A sampling of these include Google, Microsoft, Amgen, Mars, the Health Force Center at the University of California, San Francisco, and the U.S. Navy. In addition, Patrick conducts domestic and international MBTI certification program trainings and is the author of the book True Type Tales, a collection of real-life stories about MBTI type in action in everyday life. Now, let's get started. Welcome, Patrick. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Larry, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. So this whole topic of addressing misconceptions has come from using the Myers-Briggs for, I think it's 27 years as of this year. And over time, I've heard questions, like I'm sure many of you have, about people saying, I have somebody at work that doesn't really believe in the Myers-Briggs, or I read this article that critiqued the Myers-Briggs, or things like that. And when I first started using the Myers-Briggs, I didn't really know how to respond to those things. And so I would often just say, you know what? The Myers-Briggs helps people, and that's what really matters, is the Myers-Briggs is helpful. And that, in retrospect, was not the greatest response to those kind of questions. And I thought I need to really come up with a better way to respond. So started taking a deeper dive into the MBTI and taking a look at things like how it was constructed, looking at validity, reliability, things like that, and then was able to start to formulate my responses. A couple of years ago, CPP did a users conference and invited me to be one of the keynote speakers. And I chose this topic because I wanted to kind of collect all of those, some of those critiques and responses and kind of get them in one place. So to prepare for the keynote, I spent probably about 2 weeks online just doing searches of critiques of the MBTI and then kind of diving into those critiques and seeing what was their source and what was the basis for their critiques. And through that, then did the keynote. And then that led to writing the white paper and today's webinar. So all of the information we're going to go over today will help you answer questions that you'll likely get or have been getting about the MBTI. In the early years, what's kind of interesting is I didn't really get a lot of critiques of the MBTI, or at least I don't remember getting critiques, because 27 years ago, the Myers-Briggs was certainly popular, but it was not as widespread in use as it is today. People weren't putting their types on their dating profiles and things like that. There weren't even dating profiles to start with. People weren't using the internet to search for things quite as much as they are now. And so really the only thing I remember hearing in the early days of using the MBTI was people just saying, it sounds like a horoscope. And that one was pretty easy to answer, so I was okay. Then in 2004, I really saw my first taste of what a kind of a major critique of the Myers-Briggs sounded like and how widespread it could be. And that came from a book that was published in 2004 called The Cult of Personality. And that book took a number of personality assessments, one of which was the Myers-Briggs, and kind of systematically went through them one by one and kind of just shot them down. And the arguments on the Myers-Briggs were largely around hiring, but still, it really caught on. And there was an article in New Yorker magazine about this cult of personality in the Myers-Briggs. There was a piece on NPR about it. And some of my colleagues at the time, who at that time had been using the Myers-Briggs for 25 years, wrote letters, responded, trying to correct these misconceptions. But I really saw it kind of like front and center right then. Then the next time it really came up was in 2012, and there was a Washington Post article that was published to recognize the 70th anniversary of the creation of the Myers-Briggs, which was created in 1943. And so that article was, did a nice job. It gave the history. It interviewed the CEO of CPP. It also included some of the criticisms. So those would come up in workshops. And so I saw those happening. 2013, an article came out about ambiversion. And then I got a lot of questions about that for a couple of years. That's really died down in the last year or so. I really don't get that many questions about ambiverts anymore. I usually bring it up in my workshops because I want people, in case they run across it, to know the difference between that model of looking at personality and what the Myers-Briggs does. But everything we're going to talk about today will help you kind of answer things like that, because they all have something in common. And that is, at their roots, they have either some misinformation or some misunderstandings about the Myers-Briggs and how the Myers-Briggs works. Now, just coincidentally, last week, I received an email from a friend of mine in San Diego who works in the publishing industry, and she is notified of books that are coming out for publication. And so she sent me this email and said, hey, there's this book that's going to come out in September, and it's about the Myers-Briggs, and I thought you might want to know about it. And so in September, there's a book coming up that's titled Personality Brokers: The Strange History of Myers-Briggs and the Birth of Personality Testing. And so, in the early days, if someone sent me an email like that, it kind of would have terrified me, because I would have thought, oh God, now what? Now what do I have to do? But actually, I'm really interested in seeing it now to see what the author has to say and how it's presented and how the Myers-Briggs is presented. And if it's anything like the other critiques that have come out, any of the critiques, or any in it, I think we'll be able to answer them by the information that we're using today. Just to give you a little preview, just so you can know what's kind of coming, is in the link that I got, what I'm about to read is not available on the pre-order information that's on Amazon. But there are some quotes by authors, and I don't know if this is going to be as part of the book jacket or if it's going to be their promotional material. But one person said it's a gracefully written account of Catherine Briggs and her daughter Isabel Myers, a discerning history of the quest for self-knowledge. So I read that and I thought, oh, that sounds pretty good. Then the other one was written by a person who writes is usually quoted in critiques of the Myers-Briggs. We'll actually see some of his quotes today. And he said, it exposes the hidden origins of the Myers-Briggs and the seductive appeal and fatal flaws of personality type. I'm like, okay. Another author said, this brilliant book proves yet again that women were behind some of the most important scientific innovations of wartime and post-war America. I absolutely love it. And then another author said, this firsthand reporting speaks to both true believers and skeptics alike. So anyway, it seems like there'll be a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but I just want to let you know about it so that we're going to talk about critiques that have happened, and then you'll see other resources that come down the road. Okay, so what we want to do today in this webinar is we want to, first of all, start off by looking at some of the most common criticisms of the MBTI assessment. Now, in the white paper, there are the critiques throughout the white paper, but what I've included in this webinar is actually some of the actual quotes. I kind of condensed those for the white paper, but I want to show you how they look when they're actually taken out of the articles and what they actually sound like. And I'm going to give you a couple other criticisms that actually weren't included in the white paper as well. And then we want to look at some of the misconceptions or misinformation that are often at the root of the criticisms. And we want to discover how to use your knowledge of type theory, type dynamics, and MBTI evidence to respond to those criticisms. Now, there are a couple things I want to mention before we go on, and one of them has to do with this MBTI evidence here. And I, in the white paper, have talked about some of the validity of the Myers-Briggs, the reliability. In the references, I've referenced the MBTI manual, the supplement to the manual, so you have that information. Now, what's going to be coming down the road here is that CPP is actually going to release a companion piece to the white paper that's going to address some of the critiques around the psychometric properties of the MBTI. And Rich Thompson, who's the Senior Director of Research for CPP, is putting that together. When that comes out, it's going to be in a different form. It's going to be in the form of an online interface. But between the white paper and the online interface, I think you'll have what you need to address the issues we're going to talk about today and also some of the psychometric issues. Now, much like with this white paper, when the online interface is released, you'll be notified. It will be made accessible on CPP's website, so you'll be able to get your hands on that. The other one thing I want to mention is that a couple weeks ago, somebody contacted CPP and said, there's something in the white paper that I don't think is right. And it has to do with the first critique of the Myers-Briggs, which is that people often say, Isabel Myers and her mother were not psychologists. And this is true, they were not psychologists. But people hold this up and say, you know, so the Myers-Briggs can't really be that good because psychologists didn't create it. So implicit in this critique is that people have to have formal academic training or education in their field. And I think that's a flawed criticism. And to illustrate that, I pointed out other people in history who have created significant contributions where they did not have education or training in their fields. And so I talked about Steve Jobs. He's a great example, didn't finish his college degree, didn't have a degree in training, in programming, anything like that. There are actually lots of examples in technology of people who did not have formal training. I also talked about Jane Goodall, and Jane Goodall did a lot of her groundbreaking discoveries in anthropology before she had a college degree. And in fact, at the time, the academic community really criticized her work, didn't accept it, later came to accept her work. And she did go on to get her degree. And then I also talked about Thomas Edison and said he has more than 1,000 patents and that he invented the light bulb, the motion picture camera, and the telephone. And the person said he actually didn't invent the telephone. And that is actually true. Who invented the telephone has been debated for years. What Thomas Edison did invent, however, was the telephone's carbon microphone. And that was left out of the white paper. And just in case you're interested, this carbon microphone, before Edison invented that, the telephone wasn't that useful because you couldn't transmit voice data over long distances. And so this microphone that he developed allowed for voice transmission over long distances, which actually then made the telephone commercially viable. But because the white paper is obviously not focused on the history of the telephone, what we've done is we've actually just taken out the word telephone and replaced it with the word phonograph, which he actually did also invent. So if you've downloaded and printed the white paper, you can go in and download and print it again. That substitution has been made. Alternatively, if you've already printed it out, you can just scratch out the word telephone, put in phonograph. Or if you really want to get technical, you can actually say that it was the telephone's carbon microphone. All right, so let's move on here. So when you are looking at some of the critiques of the MBTI, the first place to start is really to think about, are we actually talking about the Myers-Briggs? Okay, is the article addressing the MBTI? And so I'm going to use an article here that was the subject of a lot of, it was distributed pretty widely and got a lot of press. And it's just why the Myers-Briggs test is totally meaningless. It was by Vox, came out in 2014. They updated it in 2015. It was accompanied by a really slick video that they came out where all these very hip, attractive people were holding up placards and basically like kind of reading all the critiques that were in the article. It was very compelling. And so, but in that title, there's something I want to point out, and that is this word test. Okay. And for those of you that have been MBTI certified, you probably have nightmares about this in the certification program of being told, do not call it a test. It is not a test. Tests have answers. We're not giving it back to people and saying this is who you are. That's why we call it an assessment, an inventory, a tool, things like that. And so I don't mean to quibble, but if you're going to do a critique about a topic, you need to get familiar with that topic, and you need to use the right language. And test is just not something that we use to refer to the Myers-Briggs. So that's just one point for you. Now, in that article, they also say Myers-Briggs gave titles to each of these types, like the executive, the caregiver, the scientist, and the idealist. So when I read that, I thought, I wonder if they're talking about Catherine Briggs's early work, because before she got a hold of Jung's book, Psychological Types, when it came out in English in 1923, she actually had been putting together her own framework of personalities. This was in 1917. And so I thought, oh, I wonder if they're referring to that. But I couldn't remember, to tell you the truth, the names she came up with. Well, so I looked it up, and the names that she came up with were the meditative, spontaneous, executive, and sociable. So executive obviously is, they have one in common there, but I thought, well, they're not referring to that. And what it is it's not referring to the actual MBTI assessment. So what's happened is in this article, to critique the Myers-Briggs, they've gone online, searched MBTI, probably MBTI test, and then, what happens is all these other tools come up that use Myers-Briggs language, but that aren't the actual MBTI, that aren't using the same items. We don't know the scoring mechanism. We don't know the samples that the items were tested on. And the thing is, when you're using the Myers-Briggs, like you'll notice at the bottom of all your materials, it always says like Myers-Briggs type indicator, MBTI, or trademarks or registered trademarks of the Myers and Briggs Trust, Inc. in the United States and other countries. That is true. The trust owns Myers-Briggs type indicator, MBTI. They do not own the 8 letters E, I, S, N, T, F, or JP. They don't own the combinations of letters, ISTJ, ISFJ. So what's happened is many people have discovered this and have gone online and created other tools using the same lettering and the same 4-letter types, but we don't know how they got there. And they also attach their own titles. So, no fair critiquing the Myers-Briggs by not using the Myers-Briggs. The other is it says it arrives at these names and conclusions by giving people questions such as you tend to sympathize with other people and offering them only 2 blunt answers, yes or no. Now, I'm sure all of you have taken the Myers-Briggs at least once. And I'm just have you think about, when you took the Myers-Briggs, do you recognize that question? You tend to sympathize with other people, yes or no? Now, your answer should be no, because it's actually not an item on the MBTI. It's not one of the 93 step 1 items. It's not one of the 144 step 2 items. And so again, you can't critique the Myers-Briggs by using an item that's on another assessment. I said it's like if you worked for like a Car and Driver magazine, you were going to do a critique of a Ford and you were driving a Chevy. Like you can't do that. You've got to actually use the tool that you're critiquing. So just start there, because sometimes that's where it can end. You can just say, well, actually, this isn't the Myers-Briggs. It's using the same language, but it's not the actual instrument. Okay, so the other critique you're going to see quite often is that the Myers-Briggs uses artificial binaries. And here's some of the specific quotes that come up. And one of them is, with most traits, humans fall on different points along a spectrum, but the MBTI test is built entirely around the basis that people are one or the other. And that one actually is a really kind of tricky argument, because with most traits, it's true. People do fall on different points along a spectrum, because trait instruments are measuring how much you have. But the problem is that's not what the Myers-Briggs does. It's not a measuring tool. It's a sorting tool. And Jung's theory says you have a preference towards one or the other. And then another critique, the MBTI mistakenly assumes that personalities fall into mutually exclusive categories. You are either an extrovert or an introvert, but never a mix of the two. And again, I've just put this in here because this is not MBTI language, right? We know that Jung's spelling of extrovert was with an A. Not to get too technical, but again, if you're going to critique the tool, get familiar with the language. What is not true in here is that the people are one or the other, and people are either an extrovert or an introvert. That is actually not what the Myers-Briggs says. It actually says you have a preference for one or the other. But preference doesn't mean exclusion. So you have a preference for extroversion, And those of you who have preference for extroversion are actually introverting right at this moment. And you're doing great. You're doing a great job, but it's like if you have a preference for extroversion, it doesn't mean you can't do the opposite. It's just saying that you have a preference for this one thing. And in fact, I've been trying to change my language because this is what I do for fun, is I was reading parts of psychological types in the last month, and I noticed that Jung's definition, he actually says having a preference toward extroversion or introversion. And when I think of that word toward, I really like that language because it's just a pointer, like which way do you point, this way or that way? But it doesn't mean you don't engage the other, that you can't engage the other. So this right here is really illustrating that the authors of these articles aren't familiar with the basic tenets of the MBTI assessment, which just is talking about a preference. And that's why we talk about the right hand, left hand analogy. Just a preference for one or the other. Okay, the other one that comes up is that most people are ambiverts. And this was the result of that study that I mentioned that came out in 2013. More than half the population is ambiverted, according to Wharton's Dr. Grant. His research shows that 2/3 of people are ambiverts, 1/3 either strong introverts or strong extroverts. He's also the person that gave the quote on the book I mentioned earlier. And so he's often quoted in a lot of these articles. And he actually did. He did this research study, and he was looking at the most successful salespeople in terms of revenue. And he found that using a different instrument, which was the Big Five, which is his instrument of choice, and it's a measuring instrument, and it measures along 5 traits. One of them is extroversion. And he found that the highest grossing salespeople were not people that were high on extroversion, which, that makes sense, right? You think, okay, the person that talks and talks and talks, that's probably not that great. Then he found that they weren't the people that were low on extroversion, which, by the way, is introversion. And you think about that, okay, the salesperson that doesn't talk to you, that's probably not going to be the highest grossing, but there are people that were in the middle. And so people hold this up and say, well, C type isn't true because most people are in the middle. Well, they're in the middle when you're measuring because the Big Five is a measuring tool and it says how much do you have. And whenever you're measuring how much someone has, having too much or too little usually isn't good. And usually being in the middle is more effective. Okay? What I always relate to on this one is coming back to the handedness is the Myers-Briggs, you have to remember, uses a different model. It just says you have a preference for one or the other. But what people aren't familiar with is that Jung's theory was ultimately just so clear about having a preference for extroversion does not mean that is all you do. And having a preference for introversion does not mean that's all you do. And Jung was clear that if you have a preference for E, you need to spend time introverting and accessing your inner world. And if you have a preference for introversion, you need to spend time extroverting. Okay. So I would say, like with the handedness, if we went with this model of ambiversion and said, if you use both, then you're in the middle, then anybody who types with both hands on the keyboard is ambidextrous. And I type with both hands on the keyboard. I'm not ambidextrous. I'm clearly right-handed. It influences many things that I do in my life. But when I type, I use my other hand because it just helps me do things more easily. So the measuring model cannot be confused with the sorting model of the Myers-Briggs. Okay, then where they go with that is they say, and furthermore, even Jung said, and then they start to cherry pick some quotes out of Jung's book, Psychological Types. And this to me is the most confusing critique of the MBTI because Jung's book, Psychological Types, it's like over 600 pages long. And it's not like he would write that book and then just say, oh, and by the way, it's not true. Like it doesn't really work. But they pick these quotes that make it sound that way. And one of them is, there's no such thing as a pure extrovert or a pure introvert. Such a man would be in a lunatic asylum. And that is right out of Psychological Types. Now, this is where you can really kick in your knowledge of type dynamics to address this, because Jung's whole theory was built on 2 central mechanisms. And one of them is, and it has to do with your 2 middle letters, which was, he was all focused on the middle letters, the functions. And he said, first of all, one of the mechanisms is this idea of perception and judgment, which perception is S and N, judgment is T and F. And he said, you need to use those together. You need to take in information and have a way of evaluating it, making decisions about it. And he actually said those are the 2 core functions that we're engaged in Whenever we're awake, we're taking things in, we're figuring them out. So going back and forth. And you need to use both. And he also said in those two middle letters, you have to extrovert one and introvert the other. And so in that, Jung said, if you are a pure extrovert, meaning you are not accessing any introverted part of yourself, it's not just that you won't be a high-grossing salesperson. He actually said you'll be in an asylum because you won't access your introverted world ever. And if you're an introvert and all you do is introvert, you will not access your outer world. And the same thing, you will land in a lunatic asylum. So Jung's, this statement is just saying everybody needs to use both the extroverted and introverted parts of themselves. And then they quote also, every individual is an exception to the rule. And so on this one, it's like they say, see, even Jung didn't believe his own model. There's a whole statement around that sentence. And what Jung actually said in there is he said, although there are doubtless individuals whose type can be recognized at first glance, this is by no means always the case. As a rule, only careful observation and weighing of the evidence permits a sure classification. And then there's more of that paragraph you can read in the white paper. But the upshot is what Jung was saying is actually a cautionary tale. Don't go around typing people. Don't go around thinking because what you see is what you're going to get with people. Because for every time you think you know what an extrovert looks like, you're going to find someone who actually does have a preference for extroversion, who's an exception to the rule. So people ask me that all the time, like, can you guess someone's type in 30 seconds? And I'm like, well, okay, A, I don't try to do that. But B, I've been wrong so many times that the best I can do is attach type language to people's behaviors, which I find incredibly useful. But I don't make the mistake of thinking that I know who someone is based on what I'm observing. Okay, and then this one, clinical psychologists don't even use it with their patients. So it's extremely hard to find a real psychologist anywhere who uses the Myers-Briggs with patients. This is such a tricky one because clinical psychology has at its roots diagnoses. It's looking for mental illness, mental disorders, healthy, unhealthy, things like that. And so patients is really the key word here because clinical psychologists shouldn't be using it with patients because that's not the intended use of the Myers-Briggs. Now, there are plenty of psychologists and clinical psychologists who do use the Myers-Briggs. They use it with their clients if they're doing like family therapy and things like that. And actually, when I do the certification program, there's usually at least one psychologist in each certification program who's getting certified to use it with their clients, but not with their patients. And then this one was in the Washington Post that came out in 2012. And Carl Thorson, who was the former chairman of the board of CPP, said, I used it practically, but I didn't use it in any of my research, in part because it would be questioned by my academic colleagues. And so when I saw this one, when I was putting together my keynote, I could answer a lot of the questions and the critiques, but this one really stumped me because I thought, oh, this is kind of damning statement here. And so I contacted Dr. Thorson. I just said, hey, I'm doing this keynote, and this one's kind of got me stumped, but I think there's probably more to it than in the article. And so he was very gracious, wrote me this very nice response, very long email, and he said the rest of the sentence, the context there, is that his research was on altering type A behaviors to reduce heart attack mortality. And so he said, I wouldn't have used the Myers-Briggs for that because it would have been questioned. So again, they're holding this up like, see, even these psychologists who are on the board don't even use it. But the reason they didn't use it is because they're using it properly. It's not the right tool for the job. Okay, and this is one I didn't include in the white paper, but this one comes up a lot because it often says, why is this thing so popular? Well, it's because it just flatters you. And so you'll notice that words like selfish, lazy, mean don't appear anywhere. No matter what type you're assigned, you get a flattering description of yourself as a thinker, performer, or a nurturer. And again, these things here, this thinker, performer, nurturer, not the Myers-Briggs. So again, they're referring to a different assessment. But these things like selfish, lazy, and mean, this is all using a trait kind of model, which measures how much do you have, and do you have too much or too little. Like laziness, you could say, is assessing how motivated are you. And if you are high on that, you're probably going to succeed at any cost. And if you're low on that, you're lazy, and we expect people to be more in the middle where they're balanced. Or selfish, so how giving are you? And if you are high, you might give at any cost and be selfless. If you're low, you might be selfish. And then if you're in the middle, you might be taking care of yourself and taking care of others. But that's not the model of the Myers-Briggs. And sort of like the clinical psychology example is people confuse the Myers-Briggs with diagnostic tools. And clinical psychology and psychology for a long time has been focused on diagnosing. And the Myers-Briggs is descriptive. It's not trying to find out what's wrong with you. It's just talking about common attributes of your personality type. And so even if you're an ENFP, the Myers-Briggs doesn't say, oh, you must be lousy with details, right? All it says is it's not all rainbows and unicorns. It'll say, gee, it's an ENFP. One of your development challenges may be, focusing on the steps needed to actualize your ideas, things like that. But it's not saying, first of all, it's a problem. It's not assigning a judgment to it. It's just saying this is kind of a natural blind spot that people with this preference can have. And then it says it's decidedly positive, unlike other psychological measurements of MBTI, that separate people into adaptive, maladaptive, functioning, dysfunctional, stable, or neurotic. And again, what's happening there is people are trying to look for what's wrong with you because we're so used to this model of being measured and finding out, are we good, are we bad, are we normal, are we not normal, are we high, are we low? And the Myers-Briggs just uses a very different model, which just says, actually, just have preference for this. How good you are at your type, how bad you are at your other letters, or how good you are at other letters, you only find out by having more of a conversation with someone. Myers-Briggs is one data point. Okay, then this one comes up quite a bit. So it's not predictive. And so there's no evidence to show a positive relation between the MBTI types and success within an occupation. And this one, that one statement right there appears in so many articles critiquing the MBTI, and partially because the Myers-Briggs, unfortunately, is used a lot with people saying, oh, if you're an ISTJ, you'd be great at accounting. And we actually don't have any evidence of that because the great at part talks about performance. Now, what we do know about type and careers is that certain types are attracted to certain careers. And so CPP has a publication called Type Tables for Occupations, which is basically a collection of type tables where they've given the MBTI to people in occupations to look at the type distribution, just to see are people attracted to careers in ways that type theory would suggest. So it really is a validity study of the MBTI. And you will find, like if you look at accountants, you'll see an overrepresentation of ISTJs, and you go, okay, that makes sense. But we're not saying that the ISTJs are the best accountants. And my favorite story about that is I worked a little while ago with a group of internal auditors. And so when you look at their type distribution, there were a lot of ISTJs. Again, that just validates the Myers-Briggs, that a lot of ISTJs are attracted to that field. But there are also 2 ENFPs. And so one of the people on the team was on a performance improvement plan. And a lot of people think, oh, it must have been the ENFP because, internal auditing, what a nightmare. Actually, it was the ISTJ. Because, there's more to skill than just your type. There's also type development. There's also your opportunity, your education, your interest, all those different factors. And the ISTJ that was on an improvement plan was, unfortunately, what I'm going to say is a not well-developed ISTJ in that he met every situation with I, S, T, and J. And we all know that, our types are not effective in every situation. So he was getting a lot of complaints from internal customers about his style. Now, the ENFP was a rock star. One of the ENFPs was a rock star, and she loved all the change, the variety of people that she met doing auditing. She also, by the way, just happened to have an education in accounting. She liked accounting. She was interested in it. That was a skill she developed. So it's a real mistake to say that certain people are going to be more successful in certain careers based on their types. We just don't have evidence of that. And then the characteristics measured by the test have almost no predictive power on how happy you'll be in a situation, how you'll perform at your job, or how happy you'll be in your marriage. Well, so the Myers-Briggs is not designed to do any of those things. And so, no fair critiquing the Myers-Briggs for things that it's not designed to do. On this one, it's kind of like if you looked at your vacuum cleaner and you're like, you know what, this vacuum cleaner is junk because it doesn't mow the yard. Like, I should get rid of this thing, use something else. Well, it's not designed to mow your yard. So, use the right tool for the right job. If you are looking for assessments that assess any of these items listed here, then you need to use a different assessment, not the Myers-Briggs. All right, it's misused. And this is one, this slide you'll see does not have a graphic on it. And there's a reason for that, because this first one, in extreme cases, people get tattoos. Now, if you happen to go online and you search for MBTI tattoos, you will find them. But I did not include it here because I thought it might be too disturbing for some people. But there are a couple, actually. One is an INFJ tattoo, and the other was an ENFJ tattoo, which, you know, could be some kind of validity study there based on their commonality. But okay, this critique though is extreme cases. You know, you could say in extreme cases, fill in the blank. You could pick any assessment. You could pick any. You could pick food. You could pick any sort of anything that people get that overdo that could become a problem. And I'm actually not even judging people that get tattoos, because quite honestly, you know, if you are an ENFJ who finding out your type was so life-changing that you decide you want to get a tattoo, then, you know, that's your thing. I mean, people get tattoos of their dogs, and it doesn't make me like dogs any less. You know, some people are very enthusiastic about these things. So I'm not going to even say this is misuse, but I'm going to say that people can overdo it, and that is a valid criticism, that people overdo type and try to use it for every situation, and that does become a problem. And in all likelihood, many jobs have been won or lost because of it. And some of the articles will actually have stories of people who just have had these damaging experiences where, you know, they weren't able to get into their dream career because someone used type against them, or they were dissuaded from going after something they really were, doing something they really wanted to do because of their type. And so, yeah, it is misuse, and I won't question that one at all. But that doesn't question the actual MBTI. It's actually that people can go too far with it. In the white paper, I've talked about, you know, talking about hiring is obviously illegal, and I've also included the ethics of using the MBTI assessment. But the thing is, you know, for jobs, again, skills come from many different places. The MBTI is not a skills assessment. Now, if you want to use the MBTI for hiring, you can't. But if you want to use MBTI language, sure. Like if you have a job that requires a person to, you know, meet a lot of new people and cultivate new relationships and staff trade shows or whatever it is, those are all can be associated with extroversion, but you just can't think that a person with a preference for extroversion is the only person that can do that. So you can certainly ask questions about skills, but just don't think someone that has type that seem to match those skills are the only people that can do it or do it well. You know, this just reminds me of a friend in the Midwest who has a preference for E, and she had 2 unsuccessful relationships with men who had a preference for introversion. And so one time she goes, I am never dating another I. And I'm like, oh my God, that is like so dumb. Because first of all, the last national sample used binary gender, and E and I was 50-50 with both genders. So if you say you're not going to date any introverts, you've just knocked out like half of men out of your pool. And the other thing is, not all introverts have the same level of type development, are engaged in type development the same way. It's just not a skills assessment. Okay, so the other one is it's not reliable. And so speaking of reliability, which is consistency, see in these next few quotes if you spot anything consistent. I didn't put all this in the white paper. Research has found that as much as 50% of people arrive at a different result the second time they take a test, even if it's just 5 weeks later. If you retake the test after only a 5-week gap, there's a 50% chance that you'll fall in a different personality category. If you retake the test after only a 5-week gap, there's around a 50% chance you'll fall into a different personality category. And there's more. Several studies, okay, so now we've gone from just one to now we have several, show that even when the test-retest interval is short, for example, 5 weeks, as many as 50% of the people will be classified into a different type. If you retake the test after only a 5-week gap, there's around a 50% chance. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So you get the idea here. Now, the thing is, on these articles, usually like something like 5-week gap or, you know, several studies, those are usually live links. But we know that people read things so quickly now that we don't always click on the links to see where they got that information. Now I did, and when I was getting ready for the keynote, that is one of the things I did, is I'm like, wait a minute, I got to check, I got to click on these links. Some of them weren't even active anymore. But what I found about this reliability is I thought, this is weird. They're all saying the exact same thing. They're just, basically jumbling the words. They're doing a, thesaurus to substitute words. And so I thought, I got to track this and see where this came from. So I think you'll find this interesting. I'm going to pick this article about, you have to think about like kind of what's the source. And so for the 5 articles I just mentioned, I said, where did they get this? Well, guess what? They all got it from the same place. And it was from a journal article called Measuring the MBTI and Coming Up Short. And so this is from Journal of Career Planning and Placement in 1993. Now that year is really significant because, just so you understand, like the Myers-Briggs first became commercially available in 1977. It was called Form G. And then the new revision was released in 1998, which is the Form M. Okay? Now, 1993, so this is actually not even the source of the article. This is referencing an article that was written in 1979. Okay? So he said the Form G was 1977. The source of this research is 1979. So if you think about how long it takes to write an article for publication, I mean, 2 years might be ambitious. But let's say that they actually were using the Form G. That's not the version we're using today. And so to base a critique off of reliability data that's over 30 years old just isn't valid. Now, the other thing is, if it were not the Form G, it would have been one of the prior versions. And the versions A through F were all research versions. And so then we're talking about a version that wasn't even available for commercial purchase. So this kind of stuff is really important because if you are critiquing an instrument based on an old version, it's like critiquing an iPhone 10 with the original iPhone in your hand. It's the iPhone, you can say it's the iPhone, but it's got completely different technology, obviously. And things with the Myers-Briggs, it's the same. Things have improved over the years. There have been changes in methodology in terms of selecting items, scoring items. We've actually been able to gather samples, large samples, test items on. So every version has been better than the prior. Okay, so then I want to look at some of these articles I've been referencing here. And so this one is Why the Myers-Briggs Test is Totally Meaningless, the Box article I mentioned. And so I said, where do they get their information? Okay, well, they got some of it from Goodbye to MBTI, the Fad That Won't Die. And I thought, okay, well, where did they get their information? Oh, Measuring the MBTI, Coming Up Short. So that article we just mentioned. By the way, that same article had data, quoted data going back to 1962 in its article. So it's kind of using 30-year-old data then, which is now 60 years old. It also referenced using the MBTI to study managers. That was from 1996, again, before the current version of the MBTI that we are using. Of course, it went to our friend, the Measuring the MBTI. And it also referenced, remember that you tend to sympathize with people, yes or no? That was actually from a different tool online called Humanmetrics. And so it's, again, not even talking about the actual MBTI assessment in that article. Now, in your minds, just kind of remember the placement of these boxes here, because I want to show you another article. So Why the Myers-Briggs Personality Test is Misleading, Inaccurate, and Unscientific, from 2014. I'm like, where did they get their stuff? Huh, Goodbye to the MBTI, which, okay, there we go. Using the MBTI study managers, that same one, and then referencing the Measuring the MBTI. So we've got that one. Okay, then this one that was in Fortune, have we all been duped by the MBTI? And so this one, we took a look at this, and it sourced the Measuring the MBTI. It sourced Developing Careers, which had data from 1964. Again, with the Myers-Briggs, this was before the current version that we're using. MBTI psychometric limitations, again, before the current version, and a critique of the MBTI, one expert's review, which referenced that one. So again, when you're looking at these articles, especially if they're online, please click on the links. If you're looking at a print copy of something, go to the references, check the references, see what the years are of the research. Now, this is also something I didn't include in the white paper, and there's a common theme when you read many of these articles, and it has to do with, hey, there's something that's new and improved that you should be using. So the best alternative to the Myers-Briggs is the Big Five personality types. Psychologists have spent the better past half century building a better test from scratch using the scientific method. It's called the Big Five. Right now, though, the biggest problem facing the Big Five is one of marketing. And so just as a reference point for the Big Five, it looks at 5 traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. I think that last one is probably a hard one to take into organizations. But as I was talking to someone in Washington, D.C. once, who's a big researcher there, was talking about this. He said, when articles, when many of them wind up in the same place, where the Myers-Briggs isn't worthwhile, it's bad, here's a better thing. He said, they're usually talking about one thing, and they're usually talking about money. And these articles even go on to say that, why is it so successful? Because people have been certified. And you can go out and make millions of dollars once you're certified, as you all know. And they say that once you've been certified and you've invested in certification, it's a little hard to let go of your attachments. So you're thinking like, I know the Myers-Briggs really isn't good, but I did get certified, so I'm going to use it anyway. And so I just, I think that's, in some ways, it's flattering to think that I could spend 27 years using a tool that I didn't think worked. But there's also a part of it that's a little insulting, because I think I'm not going to use something, and I don't think a lot of you are going to use something that you don't see actually working. Okay, so some next steps here is, first of all, just become familiar with the articles critiquing the MBTI assessment and books. So like this one that's coming out in September, if you can get your hands on it when it comes out or something, take a look at what it has to say. You can get a kind of a jump on what's in those articles. So every once in a while, just sit down. It's not the most pleasant task in the world, but sit down and just Google, critiques of the MBTI and see what comes up and how you'd respond to it. Make sure the articles are referring to the actual MBTI assessment, so just start there. And use your knowledge of type theory and type dynamics as you respond to your critiques, because again, a lot of these critiques really are, people writing them are just not familiar with the theory or type dynamics. And a couple things, remember, certain types will only believe in the utility of the MBTI when they see the differences in real life, okay? And other types only believe when they discover the complexity. And so with this first one, the real life, I'm going to say that's oftentimes people with a preference for sensing who, you can present the theory and type dynamics, but they're like, can we do an activity? And so you can let your activities do the heavy lifting and showing these differences. I remember I work with a lot of physicians, and I was doing a workshop in Dallas, a leadership program, and I did an activity and around conflict and the Myers-Briggs. And I remember I got them into groups based on their middle letters, and when they debriefed, I remember that there were a lot of doctors who like, no, there's something to this, isn't there? And I said, yeah, I think there is actually. And then the complexity, that's a lot of times NTs. And it just kind of validates NT, because a lot of times NTs will look at the MBTI and say, 4 letters don't describe people. People are way more complex than that. And that's absolutely true. And we know that from, if you've been certified, that, type dynamics and how the letters are working together is really the heart of personality type. But so sometimes I pull people aside at break and say, hey, there's something going on here, more going on. And there's a thing called a dominant function, an auxiliary, and kind of help them take a deeper dive. Sometimes it's just when you get to a more complex topic, like something like type and stress, where they actually see the dynamic nature of personality type, and then they're like, okay, now I get it. And monitor your own biases toward assessments and keep current. So one of the things, as bad as it is for the critiques of the Myers-Briggs that aren't really founded in knowledge about the MBTI, just as bad as people that go around and defend the MBTI without knowing why they're defending it. And so just make sure that you're not overly biased toward the MBTI and that you're using it appropriately, which kind of gets into model the appropriate use of the MBTI instrument. And it sounds really basic, and a lot of people are like, I do that, but I do the certification program, and I have heard from people that I have actually certified, who I don't know if they left the room at that moment or what happened, but I'll hear people say, oh yeah, we do this activity where I line them up by their PCI, and we have the 30s over there because they're off the chart, and then we have the 5s in the middle because, they go back and forth. And I'm like, no, you can't, you're misrepresenting the actual MBTI. You're assigning meaning to those numbers that isn't true because you're now measuring, and we're sorting with the Myers-Briggs. So just make sure that you model the appropriate use. And then I say this all the time, Myers-Briggs doesn't explain everything. People say, well, why did I do this? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, Myers-Briggs wasn't ever designed to describe every fiber of who you are as a person. It was to give you one lens for understanding yourself and understanding others. And there's a great quote that I've included in the white paper that Jung talked about, where he talked about personality type like being points on a compass. He said, they're just as arbitrary and just as indispensable. And he said, I would not for anything dispense with this compass on my psychological voyages of discovery. And I feel the same way about Myers-Briggs type. So thank you. Now I'm going to turn this back over to Larry. And Larry has been looking at your questions and is going to let me know some of them, and I'll see if I can answer any of them.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. I have a set of great questions for you.
Good.
So let's start with a question from Carrie. Carrie asks, Patrick, I heard that it is illegal to use the MBTI to hire. Is this true?
That is, well, what I have heard, okay, I'm going to qualify this one because I don't work in HR directly, but what I have heard is that in many cases, it's illegal to hire based on using the Myers-Briggs, because if someone found out that they did not receive a job because of their Myers-Briggs type, the Myers-Briggs is not a proven hiring tool. Like I said, it's not a skills assessment. And so you could leave yourself susceptible to a lawsuit. And so again, the thing, it's very well intentioned when people want to use the Myers-Briggs for hiring, because I know people are looking for fast answers and solutions, just like careers. What type's best for this career? What type's best for this job? But we know that with hiring, there's more to it than just your type. And even within your type, there's type development. So those of you that have been certified with me have heard this story, but I certified a guy in New Zealand who was an ISTJ. And with type development, you can get to a point in your life where you get a little tired of your preferences and you want to start exploring your opposite letters. Jung talked about this is kind of the point of life. It's about development and getting access to those other parts of yourself. And so he actually was an accountant, but got really tired of that and actually moved into HR, and not just the corporate global, that kind of HR, like actually helping people and doing career counseling. And so with someone like him, he was great at it, but someone like him, you might have been like, ooh, ISTJ, not going to be a great fit. Well, he's an ISTJ who is in type development, who wants to flex that muscle, who had skills in that area, and actually was great at it.
Thank you, Patrick. The next question comes from Aaron. Aaron mentions, or states, Patrick, you mentioned ambiverts, which reminded me, I was at lunch this last weekend with a friend, and I was talking about MBTI, and she said in her college psych class, they are adding T, the letter T, and A, the letter A. T standard for turbulent after the type. I'd never heard of that. I'm interested to hear about your thoughts on what that's all about, if there's time.
Wow, that is a first. Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, I actually have not heard of that. What I can tell you is it's actually, that is not something that is being added by, on the official MBTI, but so it sounds like something that's been added additionally. And I'd have to know more, actually. I'm sorry. I haven't heard that one, so it's kind of exciting. But I'm going to take a look at it and see what I can find out about it. But the only thing, I'm an extrovert, so I'm talking this out. The only thing that I can guess is it's something about if they're adding a T to describe like the stress reactions of that type, if that would be the turbulent piece, like what happens when you're, like you're an ISTJ, but here's your ISTJT, which is when you are under stress. I don't know, maybe that's what they're getting at, but that's just a complete conjecture on my part. So, so I'll take a look.
Excellent, thanks, Patrick. The next question comes from David. The question is, NPR's Hidden Brain published the statement, quote, "The MBTI fails basic standards of validity and reliability," end quote. David states here, "I asked Dr. Hammer if it fails. He says, absolutely not. So I wrote in for a correction of several items. While they eventually published a correction of Dr. Grant getting the definitions wrong, they refused to correct the statement that MBTI fails basic standards. They won't show a standard or proof, but it's on NPR. Does anyone at CPP take the task of challenging statements like that, or does the MBTI simply fail those standards?" Patrick, I responded to David, reiterating what you shared at the beginning of the webinar with regards to the CPP research team working on the online interface addressing MBTI misconceptions, misunderstandings from a more technical perspective, and that project being currently worked on and in progress, and the fact that it'll be posted on cpp.com at some point in the near future. And David further adds a correction to this story dated February 21st, 2018. In the audio for this story, interviewee Adam Grant gives inaccurate definitions of scientific reliability and validity. According to the American Psychological Association, validity is defined as the extent to which a test measures what it was intended to measure. The APA defines reliability as the degree to which a test produces similar scores each time it is used. Stability or consistency of the scores produced by an instrument.
Right.
Then David asks, but what about how, if you don't understand those terms, you also fail to assess accurately whether the MBTI passes those standards?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot baked into that one. And what I would say is, so sometimes what happens is, we know this happens in a lot of arenas, not just with the Myers-Briggs, but people that have knowledge about something that other people don't will use terminology, things like that, to try to demonstrate, competence or make an argument. And some people go, okay, I don't understand what they said, but it must be true. And so that's one thing. The other thing, though, is that the CPP, I don't work for CPP, but I have seen over the years that CPP actually has issued kind of what I'll call rebuttals to some of these arguments, or even correcting mistakes. But here's what happens, is they write back, and the original author will respond, because this is online, and they'll say, well, of course you would say that because you use the Myers-Briggs. So it's kind of like, it's like a no-win argument, because you have to know something in Myers-Briggs to actually respond to the argument. But when you respond to the argument, they say, well, of course, because that's the tool you use. And so at some point, the other thing I've discovered in all of this is that sometimes authors are just trying to be clever or witty, or at least and just get their own individual point across, and aren't really that interested in learning more about the Myers-Briggs, learning about type dynamics, things like that. And so at some point, that's just what I have to get across to people that bring those articles in is, look, we've responded to these things. The authors really aren't interested. And then the other parts of that, again, I think I'll let Rich address those because he'll be better equipped. But that's I'm really glad you brought that up because that's something that is kind of lurking under the surface with many of these critiques.
That's great, Patrick, because that addresses some additional points that David submitted, that he made. So that's excellent. Thank you very much. And to that, unfortunately, everyone, we've run out of time, but we all thank you for attending and asking so many excellent questions, raising some great points, and submitting excellent commentary. As a reminder, within the next few days, we'll email you a link to the webinar recording, along with a link to the recently published Creating Clarity white paper that Patrick Kerwin authored. Thank you all for attending and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.